And welcome to this week's digital discussion. My name is John Harry. I'm the Programs and Marketing Fellow at the Milwaukee County Historical Society. And we have quite the exciting program for everybody tonight about youth activism in driving American social change in America. Excuse me, well, that's redundant. But American social change with Lindsey Draper. And I'll get into Lindsey's background a little bit in just a second as we let you settle in. Making the correct viewing choice for tonight. You have chosen not to have a political headache in a certain way. So we appreciate you joining us here tonight with the Milwaukee County Historical Society. Some of the things we have going on right now really is our political exhibit. So yeah, it's the political time of year. We have the whole Milwaukee side of politics on exhibit right now at the Historical Center downtown on Old World 3rd Street. It's going all the way through the election. So if you want to know Milwaukee's side of politics throughout the entire history of the city, now's your chance to see that and see some incredible artifacts as well. And to talk more about the exhibit is our talk next week with our curator, Ben Barbera, who will be talking about some of the stories that are being told in the exhibit while we still have that exhibit up. So again, these exhibits don't come around all too often. So obviously, this being a political year, we figured that would be a good theme to go with. Other than that, we're getting ready for the end of the year and the holidays and all this stuff that's coming with it. So if you want to be on our mailing list, make sure that you join it at MilwaukeeHistory.net so you can know that all the opportunities you have to get involved before the end of the year as well with the Milwaukee County Historical Society. But that's enough out of me. Tonight's program is going to cover a lot of history tonight that is very relevant to what's happening in the world today as far as activism goes, especially with the youth of our country. If you have any comments or questions during it, please put those in the comment section and in the middle, and then at the end, again, we'll have a chance to ask Lindsey some questions here. But I'm going to turn it over to a guy who knows a lot about these subjects. He's got a lot of professional experience in what he's going to talk about tonight, too. He's our current Milwaukee County Historical Society Board Secretary, but formerly, now he's retired, lucky him. But Lindsey Draper was the Milwaukee County Court Commissioner as well. So has a lot of knowledge of the ins and outs of the legal system as far as what's been going on in the world today too. So with that introduction, I'd like to welcome Lindsey Draper to our digital discussion about youth activism in driving American social change. Lindsey, take it away.
Well, thank you, John. And first of all, I want to thank the Historical Society for giving me the opportunity to make this presentation. I want to thank all of you who've come to join us this evening. There are several things that I want to be sure we get the chance to talk about tonight. And so in the next hour, there's some local historical issues, as well as some national ones that have blended. Public protest has been a huge part of helping frame what's happened. And although many of them have centered around, and we tend to know adults as the big names, young people, youth have been the ones who have guided a great deal of what has happened. So that's where this talk is. We're going to talk a bit about some 20th century events, and then we're going to talk about some of the things happening here in the 21st century that have shaped social change in our country. This year, 2020, has obviously had a lot of activity. Things that started in Minneapolis worked their way throughout the country. I happen to live in Wauwatosa. We've had a great deal of activity here, but all parts of Milwaukee, all parts of the country, Kenosha, also here in Wisconsin, lots of activity and protests. And so I want to talk a bit about that. One of the driving pieces is a belief, and this is one of my favorite quotes: if the world is going to change for the better, you have to be a living example. And that means you can't stand by. You have to participate in what's happening. And we in our country have a legacy of public protests as one of our earliest protected freedoms. The First Amendment has a number of guarantees that we talk about a great deal, and one of them is the right of the people peaceably to assemble. There have been a number of movements in our country where peaceful protest has driven what we've done. And I'm just going to talk about three things to begin the talk, and then I want to move very much into the youth activity. There's been very little as memorable as this year's celebration of the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. One of the big protests involved in that was 1913, the Women's Suffrage March. This is Washington, D.C. Incredibly hard to see is square in the middle of the photograph, quite hazy in the background is the U.S. Capitol. And there's a reason that I wanted to be sure you note that. I'm going to come back to that point a bit later in the talk. But the march of many supporters, many ladies to get the right to vote was one of the major protests in our country, and they took very different forms. One of them was the Silent Sentinels. The Silent Sentinels were a group of ladies who, frankly, conducted the very first public protest outside the White House. These were ladies who, starting and frankly, they met with the president on January 9th, weren't particularly happy with the results of that meeting. And so starting on January 10th, they were out front of the White House and later moved to Lafayette Park. And they stayed there from January 10th through June 4th, June of 1919, June. And, well over a year, almost 2 years, they were protesting to basically say, how long, Mr. President, before you give us the rights that we have? And then in August of 1920 was when the 19th Amendment was ratified. Another example of the protests that I want to talk about, the 1920s saw an America that was destabilizing to a number of its citizens. This is the registry room at Ellis Island. As our country started to have a number of new citizens, Eastern and Central Europe sent a number of new citizens to our country. There were a number of pushes in Congress. There was a 1917 immigration bill. There were people who spoke different languages than most of the people in our country spoke. There were people coming into the country practicing different religions. And there were a lot of folks who were getting really troubled by what was happening. In 1924, President Coolidge signed another Immigration Act. And one of his famous quotes at the point that he signed that immigration, America must remain American. And it set that Immigration Act set a number of restrictions on who got to come into the country. In 1925, there were people who went to Washington to demonstrate their displeasure with what they saw as a change in who we were becoming as a country. They saw a dissolution of a number of the principles and characteristics of our country. Wanted to be sure you got the chance to see straight down the center of the picture, the U.S. Capitol again. This was a huge gathering. And one of the very interesting things about this gathering in DC, there were hardly any people from the South who were represented in this march. Most of these were Midwesterners Pennsylvania, Ohio, well represented in the group that were there. They marched, eventually met, had a number of speeches, and did their best to pressure Congress. They came the next year. One of the reasons I wanted to include this picture, notice the difference in the size of the representation. Not nearly as many people came the second year. The message was getting through to them as well. Their meetings and the speeches, not nearly as big a crowd, but still, number of people coming together to try, through public protest, to state this is not what we want to see happening in our country. Again, this was a troubled period in our country. And so I want to take a little time to talk about the last group that involved adults that I want to discuss. And that was the Bonus Army protest in 1932. Recalling that World War I involved a number of young people in this country who were working in school, raising families, and got called upon to go to Europe and fight a war. And they did. And they won, and they came back and went home. And as they started to rebuild their lives, along came the Depression. And many of them lost all of those things that they had started to rebuild. In 1924, Congress passed a law that said, we will give a $1,000 bonus to the veterans payable in 1945. The Depression took away a lot of the willingness of people to wait. They were losing everything. And a number of people, and much of it started in the state of Oregon, and people came to lobby Congress to talk to their government about the fact we need the money now. And as the crowd grew and 15,000, large number of people came to Washington, many of them stayed. Frankly, they had no place else to go. They camped, and for a long time, they were allowed to stay. They frankly were peaceful. These were veterans. These were people who basically had lost a lot. They were the loyal Americans. But there were people in Washington who got nervous about the fact that there were these outsiders who had come to town. And there became a large number of people where pressure was put on, among others, President Hoover, to move folks out of the city. And the Washington police got involved. But there came a point that President Hoover called in the army, and the army led by General MacArthur brought the protest to an end. As the protesters were pushed out, as their shanties were destroyed, there were a couple of casualties, one of whom, very symbolically, was buried in Arlington Cemetery. This was a war veteran. These were not just, some kind of raggedy people. These were veterans. These were people who had served their country. These were not folks who were disrupting. And as the election in 1932 came along, and we talk a lot about President Roosevelt beating Herbert Hoover in massive fashion, we normally attribute that to the Depression, but there were a great number of Americans who were just uncomfortable having seen veterans treated the way that they were. President Roosevelt was not comfortable with paying the bonus. Remember, it was to have been paid in 1945, paying it early. but he was very sympathetic to the veterans who came to town and who continued to lobby for an early payment. What President Roosevelt did was send his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was known to be very much popular with the common people and comfortable with citizens. And she went down, she talked to the veterans, she talked to their leaders, she met with a number, she went back to the president and made reports of what she saw. And one of the common and most famous quotes from that time was the comparison of the responses. Hoover sent the army, Roosevelt sent his wife. Although Congress decided in, I believe it was 1936, to pay the bonus early. President Roosevelt was not in favor. He vetoed the early payment. Congress overrode the veto, massive numbers, and the bonus army protests helped stir the payment to veterans of the funds. So those were three of the large movements that I wanted to talk about in our country, and that protests were a big part of, but this is a talk about young people. And I want to start with some very young people, the Newsboy Strike of 1899, primarily in New York City. The Newsboy Strike involved young people, and this was obviously back at the time before folks got their newspapers delivered to the mailbox or in front door. There were young men and sometimes girls, but for the most part, young men who would go to school. The big fight was with evening papers because they would sell the papers afterwards. And what these young boys would do would be buy the paper from the newspaper and would stand on the street corners and sell them. The problems became sort of twofold. One, they were stuck with the papers that they bought. The newspapers would not take back papers that went unsold. And this became a particular issue when, during the Spanish-American War, the newspapers raised the cost of the newspapers. That meant these newsboys had to pay more. After the war, the newspapers did not lower the prices. There came a point that there were some vocal members of these newsboys groups, and they said, no, that's not right. They continued not just to lose money, but to lose a lot more money because they were paying more, and the papers weren't having to spend as much for the newspapers. And so in 1899, the newsboys went on strike. They would not go get the papers. They would not stand on the street corners and sell them. But also, they get in the street and get in the way of the people trying to deliver the papers. The newspapers lost a bunch of money and eventually reached a compromise with these young boys. They had to do something. And what they ended up doing involved two of the bigger names. They did not lower the cost of the papers, but they did agree to buy back the unsold papers so that it was to the newsies' benefit. The more you sold, the more money you got, but you didn't lose by virtue of having purchased. The two gentlemen here, Mr. Pulitzer, Mr. Hearst, these were the people whose papers, Pulitzer had the Evening World, Hearst had the Evening Journal. Those were the people, because some of the papers did go along, but these were the evening papers, and these were the ones where the young boys were the main entrepreneurs. So that was the first of the events where the public protest, their strike, had a major impact. And a second one involved a lady who was really well known in the labor movement. Um, Frankly, I remembered her magazine more than I remembered her initially. But this is Mother Jones. This is Mary Harris Jones, who was known as Mother Jones throughout the labor world. She was very big in the labor movement, but a big part of her work involved young people, and she was well known for the March of the Mill Children. Um, One of the things that troubled a lot of people, and much of this started out of Philadelphia, well, these were kids who had to work. And there came a point that in order to try and draw attention to the plight of child laborers, Mother Jones decided to take a bunch of children on a march. And they were going to march from Philadelphia to New York City. And they were going to New York City because President Roosevelt was at Sycamore. He was going to be in New York. They embarked, and frankly, over the next 2 weeks, they marched to Philadelphia. And on arriving, and remember, life was a lot different then. Mother Jones got to Philadelphia and contacted President Roosevelt's secretary and asked to meet with him. Life was so much calmer and different then that people could just show up and say, I'd like to meet with the guy. The secretary said, no, the president's not going to meet, but why don't you write a letter? And she did. That's what the newspaper article was about, was the fact that she wrote him. And that letter, as well as the march, got tremendous amount of publicity. And, if you can think through how much the march would have brought about national coverage, how significant the interaction with the president was, that's how the National Child Labor Committee was formed out of this march. And that was one of the early entities working to address child labor laws here in our country. Need to move a bit because I want to get to the discussion of the mid and late 20th century civil rights movement. I need to start with World War II. And among the reason it's important to start there is that, again, very much like the young men who went to fight World War I, young men, and in this case, I want to talk specifically about young African American men, went to Europe and fought in World War II, contributed a great deal to the war effort, and then came home. They came home with many of the same dreams and aspirations and hopes as did the other soldiers, but they came home to a very different reality. I used one of the photographs from a school in Alabama that was not atypical of some of the schools. Now, obviously, this has many more problems than some of the schools that we were talking about. This was a rural schoolhouse, but the fact that this was a structure in which we expected young people to get education tells why this was such a big issue with people who had been to Europe and had been treated quite a bit differently than they had been treated before they left here. When they came home, it was with a very different mindset. And that's how, when people started to talk about what do you want? Well, many of them wanted an education for their children. In the early 1950s, the US Supreme Court ended up with one of the most famous of the cases that we know, Brown versus the Board of Education. This is a picture of Linda Brown, and I wanted to start with this picture because for purposes of the talk tonight, there was a second aspect of Brown. Brown versus Board of Education involved the combining of a number of lawsuits into one. This is the one of which we know the most because it got the headline. But I want to talk about Davis versus the county board, school board of Prince Edward County, Virginia. Prince Edward County, Virginia has a number of reasons that it is remembered, but I need to talk to you just a bit about this photograph. Prince Edward was part of the Brown decision. This is a 1951 photograph of Russell Moulton High School in Prince Edward County. There were two high schools in the county. This was the school for African American youth. And what you see is the main building. There were some subsequent smaller buildings that were constructed as the population increased. But for purposes of where these young people went to school, there was no gymnasium, no cafeteria, no science laboratories, no athletic fields. They just went to school here. Wanted to give you an example of the other high school in Prince Edward County. Worsham had 12 classrooms. There were 2 floors. There was a youth shape around an auditorium. I was not able to find a comparable picture. The one that is in color is a newer photograph, but it is the one that could show it was 2 levels instead of the single level. What happened at the school, again, recalling that there are young people who have parents who wanted their children to have the quality education that others did. There was a young lady, Barbara Rose Johns, 16 years old, was a student at Moulton. And on April 23rd, she and a number of other students managed somehow to get the principal to leave the school. And they got together in the auditorium and talked about it and decided enough. And they did a walkout of the school. They began to picket. And frankly, the next day, they went to town and met with the school superintendent. Their initial demands, they were not seeking to integrate. They just basically said, we need a new school, that this doesn't work. The school superintendent said, we will talk after you're back in school. This is not the way to do this. And there was sort of a line drawn in the sand by the students. And their objections got the support of families. And there was kind of a standoff, and there were a number of meetings. And then one day, Lester Banks, who was the executive secretary of the NAACP, met with these students and said, okay, and met with their parents, by the way, I should add, we will begin a fight. We will work with you, but building a school is not where we see this going. We need to fight this whole notion of segregation. And they started the lawsuit that ended up with that lawsuit, the Davis case, being put together as part of what became known as Brown. In 1956, the Virginia legislature met, and they were just not agreeing that this is something that we will do. They began this whole process of massive resistance. The only county that agreed to be part of the massive resistance that didn't find a way to work things out was Prince Edward County. And Prince Edward County just said, look, we will not fund any school. We will give money to people so that you can pay tuition. And a number of segregationist academies got founded, but there were no public schools for the African American youth in the county. A number of people sent their children to abutting counties to go live with relatives. Churches tried to organize, but for a full 4 years, excuse me, um, most of the students did not get the chance to go to school. And their marches were, again, a great deal of what brought federal attention. There is one picture of Robert Kennedy visiting in Prince Edward County as more and more people came to understand the problems that were going on. And it was only until 1964 when an equal protection argument got the Supreme Court to say, no, county, you cannot give money to anybody for schools. Everybody has to have the right. The schools managed to get reopened in Prince Edward County. I need to talk about, and I realize that we're about halfway through the hour, but I do want to talk about some other movements. The school efforts involved a number of places that we know about. The Central High School integration in Little Rock. And every time I look at this picture, I'm often just amazed at the strength of these young people, the 9 who went to Central High School every day with very hostile greetings. There were 9 of them, including one who was a senior, was the very first African American to graduate from the school. The picture on the lower portion with President Clinton was recognizing what a significant role this young man played in the development of what education is in Arkansas and across parts of the South now. This is one of the pictures that um, I always come back to, and that's the Ruby Bridges story out of New Orleans. Um, Ruby Bridges, and I'm going to show you a picture in a second about what Ruby was greeted with every day. But this always fascinates me. You've got these 5 men in this picture taking this little girl to school, this little girl by herself. And I'm not sure who thought she was a threat to anything. But because she wanted an education, a whole bunch of folks did not want to go along with life. These were the adults outside who protested. And there were young people who protested also. I don't know how easily you can read. I would very much, the gentleman on the left there who misspelled segregate on his sign, but there was so much hostility towards things. The protests were on all sides of things. One of the things that was interesting about Ruby Bridges went to school by herself. For that whole year, only one teacher at the school was willing to work with her. Ruby Bridges stayed friends with that teacher her whole life. And one of the reasons I've included the picture of Ruby Bridges there, she's in front of something, and it speaks, frankly, largely to how old I am, in that the Norman Rockwell drawing that's behind with Ruby and the 2 marshals was a Saturday Evening Post cover, and I happen to remember when that magazine was in our home. Need to talk about youth activity and some of the other challenges in the civil rights movement and how very much young people were involved in meeting those, and at times carried the load. One of the names that became synonymous with the work there was Fred Shuttlesworth, who at the time was a young minister in Birmingham. And as people discussed the fact that not everything was peaceful, this was his quote. He said, sometimes confrontation's not bad. When there is evil, goodness is supposed to confront it. And the biggest memory that we all have, the Montgomery bus boycott, is one of those that I think it's important to talk about in terms of youth activity. We know Rosa Parks' name well, but I think it's important to talk about Claudette Colvin, because Claudette Colvin 9 months before Rosa Parks sat down and remained seated in the bus, Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old high school student who had been studying the Constitution, was on the bus. Claudette and her friend were told to get up and move and give up her seat. And Claudette said, "No, I've been in school studying about all men being created equal. My fare is the same as everybody else's fare." And she would not get up. She ended up being arrested, and she ended up, being put, and if you can see the second of the stories, on indefinite probation as a result of her deciding to sit. Now, frankly, a few months later, we had that part of the movement that we remember the most when Rosa Parks was arrested. And these are some of the pictures that you remember the most. One of the things that I think it's important to remember about the bus boycott, we often talk about the domestics being driven to work. We talk about people who cooperated and helped. Don't forget that this lasted over a year. School children had to find ways to get to school. Also, they boycotted the buses as well. This was a united community that ended when the Supreme Court said this had to stop, and that was how here you have Rosa Parks on the bus. Just as Montgomery had issues with local transportation, the Freedom Riders tried to address interstate transportation because it had some of the same restrictions. This was a map of a route that had been envisioned by a group of Freedom Riders starting in DC. And for purposes of this discussion, we're going to chart them as they went from Washington to Jackson, Mississippi. These were young people who decided, I have to do something. The segregation on public transportation is inappropriate. All did not go well. One of their sites, the bus was stopped. The bus was destroyed. This is one of the famed pictures. And part of why this was so famous, there was a great deal of America that didn't have a whole lot invested in the civil rights movement. But if you talk to Mr. and Mrs. Helena, Montana, who needed to get to, I don't know, someplace in Missoula, Montana, they rode the bus. This picture drove some points home to people. One of the places that the bus went was to Birmingham. State troopers in Birmingham took riders, drove them to Nashville, Tennessee. They were to stay there. There were young people in Nashville who went back to Birmingham, got on a bus, were going to continue the ride, and the next stop was in Birmingham. There was federal pressure, and the governor of Alabama, John Patterson, agreed to have state troopers accompany the bus. The bus got to the outskirts of Montgomery. The state troopers stopped. The bus went to the Greyhound bus station, and you can see there were some confrontations that took place. One of the things that you won't find is a lot of media coverage. You will not find a lot of pictures of the violence that occurred, because among the first people to get attacked were reporters, newsmen, and this was one of them, news cameraman, you can see getting beaten. But as the Freedom Riders started getting off the bus, they were attacked. One of them that I want to talk just briefly about, John Zwerg, is from Appleton, Wisconsin. After finishing school, he had, after he had gone to Beloit College and then was part of an exchange program with Fisk University in Nashville. And he got involved with the Freedom Riders because he felt there was something, I need to participate, I need to help. And I wanted to show you this picture. This is after he was in the hospital. If you can notice the newspaper that he's got on him, it is the next day's edition of the Montgomery Advertiser, which was the morning paper. The picture that you see there is him standing up, bloodied. He lost teeth. He was beaten quite badly. He received a whole bunch, sometimes worse injuries than some other people did, because people resented him being there. He developed a lifelong friendship with one of the other freedom riders who got on the bus after having come from Nashville to Birmingham and then rode down, John Lewis. And these were pictures. One is obviously after they were beaten the first day, and the second was at one of the events where they both were honored subsequently. I want to talk to you also about some other people who went to Montgomery that day. If you're listening to the news now about protesters, and we hear locally about the infiltration of some marches or the presence in other places of people who travel, Proud Boys, Boogaloo Boys. We get some names that come up now. Back in 1961, there were some people who traveled also to show how they felt. And this was another group that went to Montgomery at the time of the marchers, the Freedom Riders arriving. They traveled as well. Wanted to show you this picture. If you remember, the troops stopped at the Montgomery line when the buses were coming in. This is, as opposed to a Greyhound, this is at the Trailways bus station, from which the Freedom Riders left. And you can see there was a whole lot of protection the next day. As the young people left, there were some folks who were waiting to share their thoughts. And one of the reasons I thought it was important to do this was not only to highlight the hostility, but to point out the incredible bravery that all of this involved of some very young people. Gonna, need to talk about things like public accommodations, and I want to specifically talk about the lunch counter sit-ins. This was the beginning of sit-ins where people who said, look, I can spend my money and buy things here at your store, and this is at a Woolworths, but I can't eat here. My money is equally good at one place, but not here. What's interesting about these four young people, they were all four students at North Carolina A&T University in Greensboro. They're 18 and 19 years old. These are teenagers who started a movement that changed what happened, that as some marched out front, they were met with some people who pretty much, made sure they understood how they were not particularly welcome, but they were quite successful. Wanted to show this picture because all the four of the lunch seats and part of the lunch counter is that currently at the Smithsonian. I jump a couple of years because I want you to see these three people, and they are people, don't get to tell you nearly as much about them as I think you'd love to know. Again, this is in Jackson, Mississippi, at a lunch counter. These are three, frankly, in their own right, very remarkable people. You can see that, it would take a great deal, I think, of courage to be there. A couple of moments later, they're assaulted. You can see in the first guy's hair already got sugar, the sugar being poured in the person in the middle. They were basically assaulted, handled it quite peaceably. I want to tell you just briefly about these. The guy that was on the far left was a teacher. He taught at Tougaloo College, an historically Black college, also has a Wisconsin connection. After he got his degree at Arizona State, he taught briefly at what is now the University of Wisconsin-Superior. He was the he taught, but he also was the youth advisor to the NAACP. The young lady in the middle, and as opposed to the picture from her Jackson arrest. This is her arrest as one of the Freedom Riders. She had been on one of the buses. She was 19 at the time, had been a Duke student. Would love again to tell you her story. She grew up in Arlington, Virginia, very Christian parents, very much troubled by going to church on Sunday, hearing people uh, sing. And very first song she says she learned was how Jesus loved the little children, red and yellow, black and white, they're precious in his sight, and didn't see that experienced anywhere but singing about it on Sunday mornings. She was very bothered by that, got involved in the Freedom Rides. And again, the third person, the only native Mississippian, um, ended up writing a very famous book. I want to, again, speed up a bit to talk about the Birmingham protests that we see. Again, Fred Shuttlesworth was the gentleman whose picture I showed you earlier, Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King. But what it's important to remember is they are the names, but a whole bunch of what happened in Birmingham involved young people who answered the call where adults weren't getting a lot of results. Thousands of young people responded. Again, put in harm's way dogs, fire hydrants, significant numbers of arrests. And I need you to see who it was who was being arrested, because they were saying this is not right and we have to be a part of trying to change things. Second day, and it was very interesting. Bull Connor is what the mainstream media would always call him. All of the local, especially Black radio, would make sure that everybody called him by his first name, Theophilus, because somehow he didn't see that as the name he wanted to be known by. As people continued these marches, it ended up with significant numbers of young people being taken into custody. They could not be held in regular facilities. They ended up being held at fairgrounds. And even though they ended up getting things resolved peacefully and some people backed down early in the summer of 1963, tensions were high, very ugly. And I think we all recall that in September, some of the hate boiled over, and 4 young ladies lost their lives, and a number of other people were injured in a bombing at a church. The Selma to Montgomery March that we know so much about began where 2 very famous names struggled with African Americans voting. There were people in the area marching. One of the marchers, Jimmy Lee Jackson, ended up being killed. And as a result of that, a march was planned. The march was going to go from Montgomery westbound to Selma. And one of the things, again, we know a lot about the pictures, but a lot of young people were involved in this march and had a lot to do with helping bring the attention of the nation. There are a number of pictures that I think that are clearly important to talk about. These are the images that we have become familiar with. One of the things that happened was President Johnson was just appalled by what happened, went to his attorney general, demanded a voting rights bill. At the end of the march, and remember, there was more than just the march to Montgomery, there were marches around the country. Giving you a picture here of march in New York City, and wanted to kind of fast forward because there was one last major push of the civil rights movement in the late 60s. And recall that a great deal of America had turned its attention from civil rights to the Vietnam War. We in Milwaukee were one of the last bastions of the integrated activity of civil rights activity. Much of the NAACP Youth Council 200-day marches here in Milwaukee The name that we know, we've got Vel Phillips, very famous as to the legal aspect of it. Um, Father James Groppe, one of the names that we know. Young people were the people who, in many ways, walking across the bridge, the 16th Street Viaduct, in harm's way. So wanted to be sure we talked about the fact that all of these marches, not everything's in the South, a lot of it was here. The mid-60s found growing opposition to the Vietnam War. Again, there were people politically positioned so that in Congress, some candidates for president, most of the people who were marching were young people. It's important to remember, though, that the people fighting the war were young people also, that there were people who did their call, the country called, and they responded. And so young people have been a part of both sides of a number of significant movements in our country, and the discussion about Vietnam needs to include that as well. There was a racial aspect that got involved in the Vietnam War demonstrations that quite often does not get discussed, but young people were very much a part of that one as well. And one of the things that we all remember is that a sitting president, due to what amounted to a country being torn apart and incredibly divided, opted not to run for reelection. Several other movements in that period of time. It's important to think about the um, grape boycott that had a number of marches, protests, long marches involving generational lines being crossed. Large numbers of young people as well as migrant workers participated in those. And a lot of movements reached into the 21st century. Significant among those, Earth Day is one of the ones that it's critical for us to recall. Again, there were a number of adults who participated. Young people drove a lot of the movement. I want to take some time to discuss one that is very, very much a part of what's happening now. And that goes back to Valentine's Day in 2018. Uh, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School in Parkland, Florida, was the scene of a number of murders between the time of the Columbine High School shootings and the shootings at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. There were a large number of events at schools where young people lost their lives. And every time there was a shooting at a school, and I don't want to say we got used to, we got accustomed, but it was not startling anymore when we had scenes, we had young people victimized, but observing shootings at schools. And it happened again on Valentine's Day in 2018. What we saw happen was a group of young people marshaled themselves incredibly as a result of that. A week later, a bunch of them showed up at state capitol in Florida. Large number, thousands of young people in an organized rally to say something has to be done about gun violence. And it wasn't just in Florida. The March for Our Lives movement spread across the country. There was a huge march in Washington, D.C. There was a huge march in Madison, Wisconsin. And I wanted to be sure that, frankly, if you Google March for Our Lives, you'll see that there are organizations, movements, entities related to that movement all across the country and activity taking place as recently as here in Milwaukee 3 weeks ago. Some of the strategy has changed. The movement, and this was a group that met, for instance, I believe it was South 5th Street, and in an effort to find a way to sustain a movement rather than just speeches, art against violence is part of what the movement and here in Milwaukee tried to do, and they call it artivism as opposed to activism. And uh, they, the young people have continued to say, we cannot let this issue just drop. We have been watching people, young people, die 2 decades now. That's far too long. In 2020, we've had a number of movements. This picture, to me, did an excellent job that clearly the George Floyd death brought a number of people together. There have been other issues. The LGBTQ movement has attracted a large number of young people who have spoken out. Black Lives Matter is represented in this picture. And so it's important. And again, if you look at who's in this picture, these are young folks. And it's important to note how very, very much of what's happened in our country, young people, going back to the Newsies, started some of it. In some people, in some movements, some portions served as the foot soldiers. In some instances, served as the conscience that said, we're not going to let this die. So, again, thank you.
Lindsey, wonderful. What an amazing journey you just took us on about youth activism. If anybody has any questions, now's the time to ask. I'll start it off. And that question being, this is all about youth activism and how you're saying this is so prevalent throughout all these different social movements. What do you think it is about young people that makes this occur? Why do you think young people are at the forefront of these issues as opposed to older folks like you and me?
Did you just call me old?
I put myself in that club too, Lindsey.
You did that as an afterthought. So one of the things that I think is important is the idealism and the belief that things can get better, the lack of cynicism that sometimes comes. As we get older, we start protecting, we start looking at jobs, we start looking at reputation, we start looking at what we have to lose and who might not like it. And you've got young people who are at a point in their lives when they're saying, if you're not going to fight, why are you here? That, I think we all grew up with that. If you're not willing to stand for something, you'll fall for anything. Those are the kinds of things that old people say. Young people tend to say, but it's right. And so that's why I think young people have so much been a part of moving things, is because they're willing to say what's right ought to drive what we do, and we'll worry about the consequences later.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to make. I see, the change going on in the world today. Do you think there's a unifying principle between the two, other than these people are young? Do you think there's something that unifies all these movements together?
Well, okay, so first of all, please don't misunderstand. Those of us who are older, those of us who are parents, those of us who have influence on young people can so much control how they view their fellow man, can so much control how they view, other people, how they view religions, So we've got a lot of impact. But one of the things that I think unifies all of the things that we've talked about are the strength and the willingness of young people to invest in what they believe to be right. And this perception that somehow it's going to change. And if it's going to change, it's going to be because I get involved.
Sure. Absolutely. Well, Lindsey, I think that does it for us tonight. I really appreciate your knowledge on this subject tonight and this this talk. Next week, we're going to talk about politics in Milwaukee. The political history of politics, anyway. So make sure you tune back in. And if you want to know anything more about what's going on with the Milwaukee County Historical Society, just go to MilwaukeeHistory.net. But again, Lindsey, I hope you stay safe and stay healthy, and we'll hopefully hear from you again at some point.
Thank you again, and thanks to everybody who listened.
Thank you.